Your grandmother kept something in the kitchen that no store sells anymore. A chrome toaster that reflected the whole room, a wall-mounted can opener that never needed batteries, and a linoleum floor she waxed by hand on her knees every other Saturday. Millions of Americans grew up surrounded by things like these, and not one of them stopped to wonder whether any of it would disappear. One entry on this countdown goes back to the church supper table, where the same pink salad appeared at every gathering and nobody questioned it. Wait until you reach number 45, where a quarter bought 2 movies and an entire Saturday afternoon. And entry 12 required nothing but a rubber ball and a concrete step. So hit subscribe, because here are 100 things you might be old enough to remember. Number 100, the TV tray table. Every living room in America seemed to own a set of them. 4 folding metal trays on thin legs, usually decorated with painted flowers or a faux wood grain finish, and they slid neatly into a standing rack beside the couch when they were not in use. The moment dinner was ready, someone pulled them out, unfolded the legs, and set them in front of the sofa so the family could eat while watching the evening news. The trays wobbled if you cut too hard. A full glass of milk was a gamble every single time. Children learned early that if they knocked one over, the carpet was going to carry that stain forever. By the time formal dining made its comeback and open-concept kitchens replaced the separate living room, the TV tray had already started disappearing from stores. Most families had a set. Almost nobody bought one on purpose. They just appeared like part of the house itself. Number 99. The newspaper delivery boy. Every morning, before the school bus arrived, a kid on a bicycle pedaled through the neighborhood with a canvas bag full of rolled-up newspapers slung across his shoulder. The papers were folded tight, rubber-banded, and thrown toward the front porch with varying degrees of accuracy. Some landed on the steps, some landed in the bushes. On rainy mornings, the smart ones wrapped the paper in a plastic sleeve, but plenty of subscribers opened their door to a soggy mess. It was one of the first real jobs a 12-year-old could get. You had a route, you had a schedule, and once a month you went door to door collecting payment. Some customers tipped, some pretended they were not home. By the late 1990s, adult drivers in cars had replaced most of the kid carriers, and by the 2010s, the paper itself had started to vanish. But for decades, the thump of that paper hitting the porch was how mornings began. Number 98. The overhead projector at school. It sat on a rolling cart in the corner of the classroom, a boxy machine with a flat glass surface and a bright lamp underneath. The teacher placed a transparent sheet of acetate on the glass, and whatever was written or drawn on it appeared on the wall behind her. Some teachers wrote with grease pencils in real time. Others used pre-printed transparencies stacked in careful order. The fan inside the machine hummed all period long, and the room smelled faintly of warm dust and heated plastic. Every student knew the telltale sign that class was about to get a lecture, the overhead projector rolling to the front of the room. By the 2000s, digital projectors and slideshow software made the acetate sheet obsolete. But for nearly 4 decades, the overhead projector was the most advanced piece of technology in a public school classroom. Number 97. The Slinky. It was nothing more than a coil of flat metal ribbon, about 3 inches in diameter, and it did exactly one thing. It walked downstairs. Richard James invented it by accident in 1943 while working with tension springs for the Navy, and by 1945 it was on the shelves of Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia. The first 400 units sold out in 90 minutes. Every child in America eventually owned one, and every child in America eventually tangled one beyond repair. The trick was setting it at the top of a staircase and watching it flip end over end, coil after coil, all the way to the bottom. When it worked, it looked like magic. When it did not, which was often, it crumpled into a twisted knot that no amount of patience could undo. The plastic version came later, in bright colors, but the original was steel, and the sound it made cascading down a flight of stairs was unmistakable. Number 96. Metal ice cube trays with the pull lever. Before plastic trays and automatic ice makers, freezing ice at home meant wrestling with a metal tray that stuck to your fingers if your hands were even slightly damp. Each tray had a lever across the top. You pulled it up and back, and the dividers inside were supposed to crack the ice loose into perfect cubes. In practice, the cubes came out in jagged shards half the time, or the lever jammed and you had to run the whole tray under warm water and wait until something finally broke free. Every kitchen in America had 2 or 3 of them stacked in the freezer, and the frost that built up on the shelves made pulling them out a two-handed job. The Frigidaire Quick Cube, introduced in the 1950s, was the most common design. Plastic replacements started showing up in the late 1970s, and nobody shed a tear for the old metal ones. Number 95. The Wringer Washing Machine. Long before front-loading automatics, doing the laundry meant feeding soaking wet clothes between 2 rubber rollers mounted on top of a round metal tub. The rollers pressed the water out flat, and the clothes came through the other side ready to hang. It was effective, but it was dangerous. The rollers did not stop for fingers, and hundreds of injuries were reported every year, many of them involving small children who reached in at the wrong moment. Speed Queen and Maytag built the most popular models through the 1950s. The Wringer sat in the basement or on the back porch, and laundry day was an all-morning project that started before dawn. Automatic washers with a spin cycle replaced them during the 1960s. But Wringer machines kept showing up at farm auctions and in rural homes for years after the rest of the country had moved on. Some families simply could not imagine spending the money on a machine that did everything on its own. Number 94. Silly Putty and the Sunday Comics. The egg-shaped plastic container was instantly recognizable, and the pink blob inside could bounce, stretch, and snap in two. But the real magic happened on Sunday mornings. You pressed a wad of Silly Putty flat against the color comics in the newspaper, peeled it back, and the image transferred right onto the putty. Beetle Bailey, Hagar the Horrible, Blondie, all of them lifted cleanly off the page in reverse. You could stretch the face until it looked ridiculous, squash it, and start over with the next panel. General Electric developed the compound during the Second World War while trying to create synthetic rubber, and a marketing consultant named Peter Hodgson saw the potential in 1949. At its peak, more than 6 million eggs sold in a single year. The newspapers are mostly gone now. The putty is still around, but the best thing it ever did requires newsprint. Number 93. The family doctor who made house calls. When somebody in the house was running a high fever or too sick to leave the bed, the doctor came to you. He carried a black leather bag, and he walked in through the front door like he had been there 100 times, because in most cases he had. He knew the family by name. He knew which child had the weak chest and which one was faking it to skip school. He sat on the edge of the bed, pressed a stethoscope to the patient's back, and wrote a prescription on a small pad he kept in his coat pocket. The visit cost a few dollars, and sometimes the payment was a pie or a sack of tomatoes from the garden. There was no appointment system. You called, and he came, often the same afternoon. By the 1970s, the economics of medicine made house calls impractical. Doctors moved into group practices and clinics, and the waiting room replaced the living room. But for a generation of Americans, the doctor was someone who showed up at your house when you needed him, and that made all the difference. Number 92. Flashbulbs on cameras. Taking a photograph indoors once meant popping a small glass bulb into the top of a camera, firing one blinding burst of white light, and pulling out the hot spent bulb before it burned your fingertips. Each bulb was good for exactly one shot. Serious family photographers kept a pocketful in a coat pocket or a kitchen drawer. General Electric and Sylvania made the most common models, and by the mid-1960s the flash cube arrived, giving you 4 flashes in a rotating square before you had to swap it out. The sharp chemical smell of a just-fired flashbulb hung in the air at every birthday party, every holiday dinner, every first communion and graduation. Electronic flash units replaced them by the late 1970s, and the single-use bulb became a relic of a time when every snapshot cost real money and real effort. Number 91. S&H green stamps. For decades, one of the most valuable things you could collect at the grocery store was a small green trading stamp the cashier handed you with your receipt. Sperry and Hutchinson launched the program in 1896, but it reached its peak between the 1950s and the early 1970s, when households across the country were saving them. You got stamps at the supermarket, the gas station, and the dry cleaner, and you licked them and pressed them into little paper booklets, one row at a time. When you had enough books filled, you took them to the S&H Redemption Center and traded them for toasters, lamps, luggage, or a set of patio furniture. Filling those books was a family project. Children sat at the kitchen table after dinner, licking and sticking, while their mother calculated how many more books she needed for a blender. The redemption catalog was dog-eared in most homes by spring. By the late 1970s, supermarkets began competing on price instead of loyalty gimmicks, and the green stamps slowly disappeared from checkout counters across the country. Number 90. The roller skate key. Metal roller skates did not come with built-in boots. They clamped onto the bottom of your regular shoes with adjustable grips, and the only way to tighten or loosen them was with a small, flat key shaped like a stubby wrench. Every kid who owned a pair wore that key on a string around their neck, because without it the skates were useless. Lose the key in the grass or down a storm drain, and your afternoon was over until someone on the block lent you a spare. The Chicago Skate Company made the most common model for decades, and hardware stores sold replacement keys for a few cents. Skating on a concrete sidewalk with metal wheels was loud, rough, and bone-rattling, and the vibration traveled through the clamps into your shoes and up into your ankles. When molded boot roller skates with polyurethane wheels appeared in the 1970s, the clamp-on kind vanished from store shelves almost overnight, and the small metal key that once hung around every skater's neck disappeared with them. Number 89. The bookmobile. In neighborhoods too far from a public library, the library came to you. A converted bus or a large van, painted in bright colors and packed from floor to ceiling with books on metal shelves. It parked at a designated spot once a week, usually near a school or a church, and stayed for an hour or two. Children lined up on the sidewalk and climbed the narrow steps inside, where the shelves were so close together that two people could barely pass. The librarian stamped your card and reminded you when the bus would be back. For rural kids and families in smaller towns without their own library branch, the bookmobile was the entire public library system. It smelled like old paper and diesel fumes, and on a hot afternoon the inside was stifling. But you could borrow 3 books for free, and that was enough to fill a week. Most bookmobile programs were cut in the 1980s and 1990s when budgets tightened. Number 88. Ambrosia salad at the church potluck. It showed up at every gathering. Thanksgiving, Easter, the 4th of July picnic, the Wednesday night church supper. Somebody always brought the ambrosia, and it always sat at the end of the table in a glass bowl, looking like something halfway between a dessert and a side dish that nobody could quite classify. The basic recipe was simple: canned mandarin oranges, canned pineapple chunks, sweetened shredded coconut, miniature marshmallows, and a generous amount of Cool Whip or sour cream folded together. Some cooks added maraschino cherries, others stirred in pecans or sliced bananas. The name itself came from Greek mythology, the food of the gods, which was ambitious branding for a dish that required no cooking, no measuring, and no particular skill. You could find the recipe on the back of the marshmallow bag. The appeal was not sophistication. The appeal was that it was sweet, it was cold, it took 10 minutes to assemble, and every child at the table asked for seconds. Grown-ups pretended they did not care for it, and then quietly went back with a clean spoon. The church potluck itself was a kind of social contract that ran on trust. Every family brought one dish, Nobody coordinated in advance. You ended up with 4 casseroles, 2 plates of deviled eggs, a bucket of fried chicken, someone's famous banana pudding, and the ambrosia. There was no reservation, no printed menu, and no bill at the end. You ate on paper plates, drank sweet tea from a styrofoam cup, and sat beside people you had known since childhood. Conversation drifted from crops to grandchildren to who was ailing and who had passed. The ambrosia was never the best thing on the table and never the worst. It was just always there, reliably the same, and when it stopped appearing at gatherings, nobody could quite say when or why. The recipe still circulates online. The potluck, for the most part, does not. Number 87. The SRA reading box in the classroom. It was a long cardboard box, slightly bigger than a shoebox, and inside were hundreds of reading comprehension cards arranged by color. Each color represented a difficulty level, starting with pale colors and working toward darker ones. You pulled a card from the box, read the short passage on one side, and answered the questions on the back. When you finished the set, you moved on to the next color. The entire system was self-paced, which meant the fastest readers in the class were always 3 or 4 colors ahead of everyone else, and everyone knew it. Science research associates developed the system in the 1950s, and by the 1960s it was in public schools nationwide. There was no prize for finishing first. There was no punishment for being slow. But the quiet competition of moving from one color to the next was as motivating as any grade on a report card. Number 86. Slide projectors and home movies. Before video cameras and smartphones, the way a family preserved its memories was on thin strips of film or tiny squares of mounted celluloid. The Kodak carousel projector, introduced in 1961, became the gold standard for living room screenings. Someone pulled down a portable screen, turned off the lights, and clicked through a circular tray of 80 slides, one at a time. Every vacation, every wedding, every backyard birthday party lived in those trays, gathering dust in a closet until someone pulled them out again. The projector hummed, the fan blew warm air across the room, and every few clicks a slide jammed and someone had to fix it by hand. Home movies on 8mm film were the moving version of the same impulse. A handheld camera, a reel sent off for processing, and a small projector throwing a shaky, silent image onto the wall. It was slow and imperfect, and that is exactly what made it feel honest. Number 85. Mercurochrome on every scrape. If you fell off your bicycle or skinned your knee on the sidewalk, you already knew what was coming. Your mother pulled out a small brown bottle with a glass applicator built into the cap and painted the wound with a bright red-orange liquid that stained the skin and burned just enough to make you flinch. Mercurochrome was the standard antiseptic in American households from the 1930s through the 1990s. Some families preferred merthiolate, which came in a similar bottle but stung considerably worse. Neither product required a prescription. Neither one came with much in the way of instructions. You dabbed it on, blew on it because your mother told you to, and went back outside with a knee that looked like it had been painted with food coloring. The Food and Drug Administration reclassified mercurochrome as not generally recognized as safe in 1998 because it contained mercury. The stinging, the staining, and the absolute certainty that it was fixing something were all gone overnight. Number 84. The Kodak Instamatic Camera. Before the smartphone made everyone a photographer, there was a small, boxy plastic camera that used a drop-in film cartridge and required exactly no skill to operate. Kodak introduced the Instamatic in 1963, and by 1970, more than 50 million units had been sold worldwide. The camera was cheap, the film was cheap, and anyone could use it. You aimed, you pressed the button, and that was it. No focusing, no adjusting, no settings. The film cartridge was a sealed plastic unit that snapped into the back of the camera with a satisfying click. When you finished the roll, you dropped it off at the drugstore or mailed it to a processing lab and waited a week or more for your prints. Half the pictures came back blurry. A quarter had a thumb in the corner or a head cut off at the forehead. But the ones that turned out captured birthdays, vacations, first days of school, and family reunions with an honesty that no filter or edit could improve. Those prints still sit in shoeboxes in closets across America. Number 83. The hula hoop. In the spring of 1958, the Wham-O company released a 3-foot plastic ring based on a bamboo exercise hoop that Australian children had been using in gym class. Within 4 months, 25 million of them had been sold in the United States alone. Every child on every block had one. The trick was simple in theory. Stand with the hoop around your waist and swing your hips to keep it spinning. Some kids could keep it going for 5 minutes without stopping. Others could not get past 3 rotations before it clattered to the ground. Competitions broke out on sidewalks and in backyards. Someone always claimed they could spin 2 at once. The craze burned hot through 1958 and 1959 and then cooled off, but the hula hoop never fully disappeared. It kept showing up at garage sales, in gym storage closets, and in toy aisles next to jump ropes and rubber balls. For a few months in the late 1950s, it was the most popular toy in the country, and almost nobody threw theirs away. Number 82. Square dancing in gym class. Somewhere around 4th or 5th grade, the gymnasium stopped being a place for dodgeball and rope climbing and turned into a dance floor. The teacher wheeled out a record player, dropped the needle on a square dance record, and a caller's voice echoed through the gym. Doocy-doo. Swing your partner, promenade. Boys stood on one side. Girls stood on the other. Nobody wanted to hold hands. Everyone had to anyway. The idea was that learning traditional American folk dance would build character and social skills, and Congress in 1982 actually considered making the square dance the official national dance. For most students, the lasting memory is the awkwardness. Sweaty palms, the wrong partner, turning the wrong direction, and the absolute relief when the record ended. But buried in that awkwardness, there was also the first time a lot of kids learned to follow instructions with a partner and laugh about getting it wrong. Number 81. The weekly reader. Once a week, usually on a Tuesday or Wednesday, the teacher handed out a thin newsprint publication that was designed specifically for the grade level of the class. The weekly reader covered current events, science discoveries, health tips, and the occasional special feature on an animal or a country that most students had never heard of. Menili Kurdi Vininu. It was not a textbook and it was not a worksheet, and that made it feel like something almost fun. The articles were short, the photographs were black and white. There was always a small vocabulary section and sometimes a quiz. American education publications launched it in 1928, and at its peak, more than 8 million students received a copy every week. The classroom subscription cost almost nothing, and for many children in smaller towns, the weekly reader was their first exposure to news from outside their own community. By the 2010s, digital content had replaced most classroom subscriptions, and the weekly reader ceased print publication entirely. A whole generation learned what was happening in the world one page at a time. Number 80. The phone booth on the corner. Before the cell phone changed everything, the only way to make a call away from home was to find a phone booth. They stood on sidewalks, outside gas stations, in drugstore lobbies, and near the entrance of every bus terminal. A local call cost a dime for decades, then a quarter. You stepped inside, pulled the folding glass door shut behind you, dropped your coin into the slot, and dialed. For a moment, you had a tiny private room in the middle of the public world. Clark Kent used one to become Superman. Thick, yellow phone books dangled from a metal chain inside. By the late 1990s, cell phones had made the booth irrelevant almost overnight. Cities pulled them from the sidewalks. Today, finding a working phone booth anywhere in America is close to impossible. Number 79. Cloth diapers and safety pins. Before the disposable diaper became the standard, every baby in the country wore a folded square of soft white cotton held in place by 2 large safety pins at the hips. Changing a diaper meant folding, the cloth into a neat triangle or rectangle, positioning it just right, and pinning it without poking the baby. There was a technique to it, and every new parent figured it out fast by necessity. A bucket of soiled diapers soaking in the bathroom was a fixture in any home with an infant. Procter & Gamble launched Pampers in 1961, but disposables were unreliable and expensive for years after that. Most families did not fully make the switch until the mid-1970s. The cloth diaper and its pins were a simple daily reality of raising children for generations. Number 78. The Automat. Picture a restaurant with no waiters, no visible kitchen, and no one behind a counter. Instead, there was a wall of small glass compartments, each one displaying a single dish: a slice of coconut cream pie, a bowl of baked beans, a ham and cheese sandwich on white bread. You dropped your nickels into the slot beside the door. It clicked open, and you carried your plate to a table. Horn and Hardart operated the most famous automats in New York City and Philadelphia from the early 1900s through the 1960s. At their peak, they fed more people per day than any restaurant chain in the country. The food was basic, affordable, and replenished from a hidden kitchen behind the compartment wall. Fast food chains undercut them on speed and price by the late 1960s, and the last Horn and Hardart location in New York closed its doors in 1991. Number 77. The hand-pushed reel lawnmower. Before the roar of the gas-powered engine became the sound of every Saturday morning, cutting the grass was a quiet job. The reel mower had no motor. It was a set of curved steel blades arranged in a cylinder between two wheels, and it cut the grass only because you pushed it. The faster you walked, the faster the blades spun. The slower you walked, the less it cut. On a small suburban lot, the job took about 30 minutes. On a bigger yard, it took the better part of a morning, and both arms knew it. The machine weighed next to nothing compared to the gas mowers that replaced it, and it made a gentle whirring sound that neighbors barely noticed. Nobody wore ear protection. Nobody checked the oil. If the blades got dull, you took it to a shop or sharpened them yourself with a file. Motorized rotary mowers began taking over in the 1950s, and by the 1970s, the reel mower was a relic gathering rust in the back of the garage. Number 76. The carpet sweeper. Before the electric vacuum cleaner became a fixture in every household, floors were cleaned with a manual carpet sweeper, a low, flat box on wheels with a long handle and a set of rotating bristle brushes powered entirely by the forward push of your arm. Bissell made the best-known models starting in the late 1800s, and the name became so associated with the product that many people called any sweeper a Bissell regardless of the brand. The device was quiet, lightweight, and required no power cord. It handled crumbs and surface dust reasonably well, but anything ground into the carpet fibers was staying put. Yarantigun. Families who could not afford an electric vacuum depended on the sweeper for years. Even after plug-in vacuums became the standard in the 1960s, plenty of grandmothers kept a carpet sweeper in the hall closet for a quick pass between meals, and some swore it did a better job on hard floors than any vacuum ever could. Number 75. The clothesline in the backyard. Before the electric dryer became standard, every siege in the end. Mosh fwareth when humtra medium. Mui bisum beta tengim. Yolancer speenpors, vinchin korshal necephavis. House had a clothesline strung across the backyard. Two metal T-shaped poles anchored in the ground, a length of cotton or nylon rope stretched between them, and a canvas bag of wooden clothespins hanging from the line itself. Laundry day meant carrying a heavy basket of wet clothes outside, pinning each piece to the line and hoping the weather held. Sheets billowed like sails, shirts hung by the shoulders, socks were pinned in pairs. The smell of laundry dried in open air was something no dryer sheet ever replicated. In winter, clothes froze stiff on the line and had to be brought inside like boards to thaw and soften. Sears sold retractable clothesline reels that bolted to the side of the house for smaller yards. By the 1980s, Automatic dryers had become affordable enough that the backyard clotheslines started to disappear, and some homeowner associations began banning them outright as an eyesore. A few states eventually passed right-to-dry laws to push back. Number 74. The Avon Lady. For decades, Avon Products built its entire business on a simple model: women selling cosmetics, perfumes, and skincare products directly to other women in their homes. The Avon representative carried a sample case and a catalog, and she visited her neighbors on a regular schedule. In many neighborhoods, she was the only source of beauty products outside of a department store counter. Avon launched the door-to-door approach in 1886, and by the 1960s the company had hundreds of thousands of representatives across the country. The doorbell and the phrase "Avon Calling" became one of the most recognized advertising slogans in America. Deonteng. As shopping malls expanded and drugstore beauty aisles grew in the 1980s, the home visit model started to lose ground. The Avon Lady still exists in some form today, but the days of a regular knock on the door are largely over. Number 73. Blue Laws and Everything Closed on Sunday. There was a time in America when Sunday meant one thing for retail: nothing was open. Blue laws, some dating back to colonial-era statutes, prohibited most commercial activity on Sundays in towns and cities across the country. Grocery stores, hardware shops, car dealerships, and department stores all locked their doors. Gas stations might stay open, and pharmacies could fill prescriptions, but everything else waited until Monday morning. The logic was religious in origin, tied to the Christian Sabbath, but by the mid-20th century, most people just accepted it as the way things were. States began repealing their blue laws in the 1960s and 1970s, and the process stretched into the 1980s and beyond. Even now, scattered remnants survive. A handful of counties still ban car sales on Sundays, and some states restrict liquor purchases before noon. But the era when an entire town shut down for the day is gone. Number 72. The drugstore soda fountain. Before fast food chains colonized every intersection, the place where Americans went for a cold drink and a quick bite was the counter at the back of the local pharmacy. The drugstore soda fountain was part restaurant, part social club, and part neighborhood landmark. Long formica counter with round swivel stools ran the length of the back wall. Behind it, a soda jerk in a white paper hat mixed drinks by hand. Cherry phosphates, egg creams, lime rickeys, and root beer floats built from scratch with real syrups and carbonated water. A grilled cheese sandwich cost $0.25. Chocolate malt ran 35 cents. Teenagers gathered there after school. Retired men sat at the end of the counter reading the newspaper. Mothers brought small children in for a treat after a trip to the doctor upstairs. Walgreens, which started as a single drugstore on the south side of Chicago in 1901, grew partly on the strength of its soda fountain business. Rexall, Cunningham, and thousands of independent pharmacies did the same. At its peak in the 1950s, the drugstore fountain was as common as a gas station. The decline started in the 1960s. Self-service soda machines, fast food restaurants, and the shift toward large chain pharmacies all chipped away at the model. The stools were pulled out, the counters were replaced with aisles of shampoo and greeting cards. By the 1980s, the drugstore soda fountain had all but vanished from American towns. A few holdouts still operate in small cities across the South and Midwest, mostly running on nostalgia and local loyalty. But for the generation that grew up sitting on those stools, the soda fountain was never about the drink, it was about having a place to go. Number 71. A playing card clipped to the bicycle spokes. Every kid who wanted a louder bike knew the trick. You took a baseball card or a regular playing card from the kitchen drawer, clipped it to the frame with a clothespin so it stuck into the spokes, and suddenly your bicycle sounded like a small engine. The faster you pedaled, the louder it got. Nobody taught this. It passed from one kid to the next on the block, summer after summer, as naturally as a secret handshake. Some kids used 2 or 3 cards for maximum volume. The sacrifice was always a card that someone might regret later. a Mickey Mantle, or a Hank Aaron lost forever to the spokes of a Schwinn. By the time BMX bikes arrived in the 1980s, the clothespin and card trick had mostly faded, replaced by plastic spoke beads and factory accessories that never sounded quite as good. Number 70. The linoleum floor in the kitchen. It covered nearly every kitchen and bathroom in America from the 1930s through the 1970s. The pattern was usually a geometric design or a faux tile print in shades of green, gold, or brown, and after enough years of foot traffic, the edges curled up near the baseboards and the pattern wore thin in front of the sink and the stove. Mothers waxed it on their hands and knees with a paste wax and a rag, and for a few hours after, the surface was so slick that socks became a hazard. Armstrong was the name most families knew. The material was made from linseed oil, cork dust, and pigment pressed onto a burlap backing, and it arrived in enormous rolls that a professional cut and glued to the subfloor. When vinyl flooring replaced it in the 1970s, most homeowners pulled up the old linoleum and found decades of history underneath. Number 69. Pull-tab soda cans. Before the stay-on tab that is standard today, opening a can of soda or beer meant pulling a small metal ring that ripped the entire tab clean off the top. The detached tab was a sharp, jagged piece of aluminum with nowhere to go. People dropped them on the ground, tossed them into the nearest bush, or pushed them down through the opening into the drink itself. Beaches, parking lots, and playgrounds were littered with them. Bare feet paid the price. The pull tab was introduced in 1962 by the Pittsburgh Brewing Company on its Iron City beer cans. It was convenient, but the litter problem became so severe that several states considered banning it outright. The stay-on tab, which bends inward without detaching, appeared in 1975 and gradually replaced the pull tab over the next decade. By the late 1980s, the removable tab had disappeared from American store shelves. Number 68. Castor oil as the cure for everything. In households across mid-century America, castor oil was the first response to nearly any childhood complaint. Stomachache, constipation, a cough that would not quit, general sluggishness on a school morning. The thick, yellowish oil came in a dark glass bottle, and a tablespoon of it was forced on children with the grim efficiency of a field medic. The taste was so memorably awful that the threat of castor oil alone was sometimes enough to make a child claim recovery. Mothers and grandmothers swore by it. Doctors rarely recommended it. The remedy had roots stretching back centuries, but its peak as an American household staple ran from the 1940s through the 1970s. Modern medicine eventually replaced it with targeted treatments, and by the 1990s, the dark bottle had disappeared from most bathroom shelves. Number 67. The metal lunchbox with a thermos inside. Every September, the new school year started with a new lunchbox. It was made of stamped metal, printed on all four sides with characters from a television show or a movie. The Lone Ranger, the Jetsons, Star Trek, the Partridge Family, or whatever had captured that year's attention. The matching thermos fit inside a bracket in the lid, and the whole thing latched shut with a small metal clasp. Aladdin Industries and Thermos brand dominated the market from the 1950s through the 1970s. A new lunchbox cost $1 or $2, and it followed a child to school every day for an entire year, getting dented and scratched until the paint chipped at the corners. The thermos was always the weak point. One drop on the cafeteria floor cracked the glass vacuum liner inside, and after that it never kept anything warm again. By the mid-1980s, manufacturers switched to molded plastic, and the tin lunchbox with its painted artwork became a collector's item instead of a daily companion. Number 66. Trick-or-treating without a parent in sight. On Halloween night, the front door opened and children scattered into the dark. They moved in packs of 4 or 5, carrying pillowcases or plastic pumpkin buckets, and they knocked on every door in the neighborhood without a single adult walking behind them. The rule was simple: stay on the sidewalk, do not cross the highway, and be home by 9. Nobody checked the candy. Nobody worried about which houses were safe. If the porch light was on, you knocked. If it was off, you moved on to the next one. Some homeowners handed out full-size candy bars, and their address was circulated like inside information among every kid on the block. By the 1990s, organized trunk-or-treat events in church parking lots and mall trick-or-treat nights had begun replacing the door-to-door tradition, and the idea of an 8-year-old wandering the streets at dusk without supervision had started to feel unthinkable. Number 65. Ashtrays in every room of the house. Walk into almost any American home in the 1950s or 1960s, and you would find an ashtray on the coffee table, one on the kitchen counter, one on the nightstand, and often one mounted to the arm of a recliner. Smoking was not something people did outside or in a designated area. It was something they did everywhere, all the time, without a second thought. Guests were offered cigarettes the way they were offered coffee. Crystal ashtrays were wedding gifts. Ceramic ones shaped like leaves or animals were sold at every department store. Restaurants had them on every table. Airplanes had them in every armrest. Even hospital rooms had ashtrays on the bedside tray. The cultural shift started in the 1970s, accelerated through the 1980s, and by the early 2000s, the household ashtray had become an antique shop curiosity. Number 64. The Welcome Wagon Lady. When a new Welcome Wagon International had representatives in thousands of towns and cities across the country, the visit felt personal, even though it was commercial at its core. Every coupon and sample in the basket was paid for by a local business hoping to gain a new customer. The model faded as suburbs grew larger and more anonymous in the 1970s and 1980s, and by the 1990s, the Welcome Wagon visit was a memory. Number 63. The Aluminum Christmas Tree. In 1959, the Aluminum Specialty Company of Manitowoc, Wisconsin, introduced a silver Christmas tree made entirely of aluminum branches. Within 2 years, it was one of the hottest holiday items in the country. The trees came in heights from 2 feet to 8 feet, and the branches were strips of polished aluminum attached to a central pole. Because metal and electricity were a dangerous combination, the trees were not decorated with standard string lights. Instead, families placed a rotating color wheel on the floor beside the tree, a spotlight with a disc of colored gels that slowly turned, bathing the silver branches in red, blue, green, and gold. Meaning the effect was either beautiful or bizarre, depending on your taste. Over 1 million aluminum trees were sold in the United States by the mid-1960s. The trend collapsed almost as fast as it had arrived, partly because the Charlie Brown Christmas special in 1965 openly mocked artificial trees in favor of real ones. By 1970, the aluminum tree was done. Number 62. The Shoe Fitting Fluoroscope. From the 1920s through the 1950s, shoe stores across the country kept a large wooden cabinet near the fitting area. It contained an X-ray tube. You stepped up onto a small platform, slid your feet into the opening at the base, and looked down through a viewing scope at a green glowing image of the bones inside your shoes. The machine was supposed to help the salesman judge the fit. In reality, it gave children and their parents a dose of ionizing radiation every time they tried on a new pair of saddle shoes. Adrian Shoe Stores and Tom Mackin were among the chains that used them regularly. Concerns about radiation exposure grew through the 1950s, and by the early 1960s, most states had banned or restricted the devices. The machines were quietly removed, and a generation of Americans was left with the strange memory of seeing their own foot bones glowing green in a shoe store. Number 61. The Pressure Cooker Whistling on the Stove. It sat on the back burner like a small steel bomb, a heavy pot with a locking lid and a weighted valve on top that rocked and hissed once the steam built up inside. The principle was simple. Sealed steam raised the internal temperature above the normal boiling point, and food that would have taken hours to cook was ready in a fraction of the time. Murizen time. Hot roasts, stews, dried beans, and canned vegetables all went through the pressure cooker. The sound it made was distinctive, a rhythmic clatter and hiss that every child in the house, learned to recognize as a warning to stay away from the kitchen. Occasionally, the stories got darker. Everyone knew someone who claimed their mother's pressure cooker had exploded, launching chicken stock across the ceiling. Whether or not it was true, the fear was real, and by the 1980s, many home cooks had switched to slow cookers that posed no threat of eruption. Number 60. Canning season in late summer. When the garden came in and the peaches were ripe at the farm stand, the kitchen turned into a production line. Mason jars were pulled from the basement shelves, inspected for cracks, and lined up on the counter. The water bath canner sat on the stove, a tall black pot with a wire rack inside. Tomatoes were blanched and peeled. Cucumbers were sliced for pickles. Green beans were snapped and packed into jars with a teaspoon of salt. The lids were boiled to soften the rubber seal, and once the jars were filled and sealed and processed, they were set on a towel on the kitchen table to cool. The sound everyone waited for was the small metallic pop of each lid sealing as the jar cooled down. A good canning weekend could fill a pantry shelf with enough vegetables and preserves to last through February. The women who did this learned from their mothers, who learned from theirs, and the cycle continued until the supermarket made it cheaper to buy than to put up. Number 59. Cap guns and holster sets. Every toy aisle in the 1950s and 1960s had an entire section devoted to realistic-looking pistols and rifles built for children. The cap gun was the centerpiece. It was a die-cast metal replica of a revolver, finished in chrome or black, and it fired paper caps that made a sharp crack and left behind a wisp of sulfur-scented smoke. The rolls of red caps came in small boxes and cost a few cents. For $1 or $2 more, you could get a tooled leather holster set with a belt, just like the cowboys on television. Mattel's Fanner 50 and the Nichols Stallion 45 were among the most popular models. Kids wore them to school for show and tell without raising a single alarm. The cultural shift away from toy guns began in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s and 1990s, and the era of chrome-plated toy revolvers in a child's waistband passed into history. Number 58. Making valentines by hand for every kid in class. For weeks before February 14th, the kitchen table was covered in red and pink construction paper, white glue, blunt-tipped scissors, paper doilies, and those small conversation hearts that said, "Be mine and kiss me" in faded letters. The teacher had one rule. If you brought valentines, you brought one for every student, no exceptions. That meant sitting down with the class roster and writing a name on every single envelope, including the kid who ate paste and the kid who never talked and the kid who had been mean to you at recess the week before. The valentines ranged from elaborate to barely functional. Some children spent hours cutting out hearts and gluing lace borders and sprinkling glitter that would show up in the carpet for the next 6 months. Others folded a piece of red paper in half, wrote Happy Valentine's Day in crayon, and considered the job done. Drugstores sold boxes of pre-made cards featuring cartoon characters, usually 32 to a box, and those were perfectly acceptable. But there was always at least one mother who insisted her child make every single Valentine from scratch, and that child either deeply resented the project or took enormous pride in the finished stack. On the day itself, each desk had a decorated paper bag or a shoebox with a slot cut in the lid, taped to the front. You walked around the room dropping each envelope into the correct box. The rest of the afternoon was spent tearing them open, reading the messages, eating the candy, and quietly counting to make sure you received as many as everyone else. The ones with a lollipop taped to the front were the undisputed winners. None of it cost much. A few sheets of paper, a bag of candy hearts, some glue. But for one afternoon in February, every child in the room was remembered by name, and for some of them, that was the part that mattered most. Number 57. The telephone cord stretched around every corner. Before cordless phones, every call taken in the house was tethered to a wall by a coiled cord that stretched, twisted, and tangled into permanent knots. Teenagers who wanted privacy pulled that cord as far as it would go, around the kitchen door frame, down the hallway, and into the bathroom or a closet. shutting the door on the cord and whispering into the receiver. The cord was never long enough. After a few months of daily stretching, the coils lost their shape entirely and hung in a loose, drooping spiral that dragged across the floor. Replacement cords in 25-foot lengths were sold at hardware stores for exactly this reason. The arrival of cordless phones in the 1980s made the whole struggle obsolete, but the memory of that tangled cord is burned into the brain of anyone who ever tried to have a private conversation in a house with no walls thick enough to matter. Number 56. The window unit air conditioner. Before central air became standard in American homes, cooling down meant jamming a heavy metal box into a window frame and hoping it held. The unit hung half inside and half outside, propped up by a bracket or sheer faith, and it dripped water onto the bushes below while it rattled and hummed loud enough to drown out the television. A single window unit could cool one room, maybe two if you left the doors open and aimed a box fan down the hallway. The bedroom with the air conditioner became the most popular room in the house on August nights. Families crowded in with sleeping bags and pillows. The electricity bill doubled in the summer, and the filter needed cleaning more often than anyone remembered to do it. Installing it was a two-person job that tested every relationship it touched. Taking it out in the fall revealed a window frame caked in grime and dead insects. Number 55. Penny candy at the corner store. There was a time when a nickel could buy 5 pieces of candy, and a quarter made you feel wealthy. The corner store, or the 5 and dime, kept its candy in jars or open bins near the register, and children pointed at what they wanted 1 piece at a time. Number Janes, Bit-O honey, root beer barrels, bazooka bubblegum, wax, bottles filled with colored syrup, and fireballs that burned your tongue for 15 minutes. The transaction was slow and deliberate. A child with a dime could spend 5 minutes choosing. The shopkeeper waited patiently, or not so patiently, while tiny fingers pointed and changed their minds. By the 1980s, individually packaged candy bars and pre-bagged assortments replaced the open bins, and the price of a single piece climbed well past a penny. The ritual of choosing 1 piece at a time from behind a glass counter faded with it. Number 54. The telephone table in the hallway. The phone did not live in your pocket. It lived on a small table in the hallway, usually near the front door, with a chair beside it and a notepad and pen within arm's reach. Some tables had a built-in shelf underneath for the phone book. The hallway was chosen because it was central to the house and because a phone call was not considered a private event. Everyone in the family could hear your half of the conversation. Teenagers stretched the cord into the nearest closet for some measure of secrecy. But even through a closed door, the household knew you were on the phone. The table itself was a modest piece of furniture, sometimes a small bench with a backrest, sometimes a narrow stand just wide enough for the phone and an address book. When cordless phones arrived in the 1980s, the table lost its purpose. Most families kept it for a while out of habit, and then quietly moved it to the basement. Number 53. The school film projector. On certain days, the classroom lights went off. The teacher wheeled in a heavy metal cart, and a 16mm film projector clattered to life at the back of the room. A beam of light cut through the dust and hit a pull-down screen mounted above the chalkboard. The films were educational in the loosest sense, grainy, narrated by a man with a formal mid-Atlantic accent, and usually 10 to 15 years out of date by the time your school got hold of them. Threading the film through the projector was an art form that only the teacher or the designated AV kid could manage. When the film jumped the sprocket, which happened at least once per screening, the image froze, the audio warped into a low growl, and the entire class erupted. Bell and Howell and the Kodak pageant were the most common projector models. By the 1990s, VHS tapes and eventually DVDs replaced the reels entirely. Number 52. Tang, the astronaut drink. In 1959, General B.F. Burgoyne Foods introduced a powdered orange drink mix that might have remained a minor grocery item if not for the space race. When NASA included Tang on Gemini missions in the mid-1960s, the company leaned into the association with everything it had. The advertising campaign linked Tang directly to the astronauts, and overnight it became the drink of the future. Children begged their parents for it. The powder came in a glass jar, and you mixed a spoonful into a glass of cold water. It tasted nothing, like real orange juice, and that was part of the appeal. It tasted like space. At its peak, Tang was in kitchens across the country. The novelty wore off by the late 1970s as consumers moved toward natural juices, but Tang held on internationally and is still sold in dozens of countries today. Number 51. The barber pole. A red, white, and blue striped cylinder spinning slowly outside a small shop on Main Street. That was how you found the barber. The pole has origins stretching back to medieval Europe, where barbers also performed minor surgery and bloodletting, and the red and white stripes are said to represent blood and bandages. In mid-century America, the barber pole marked a place that was more than a business. It was a neighborhood institution. Men waited on wooden chairs, read the newspaper, and talked about baseball while the barber worked through the line one head at a time. A haircut cost $1 or $2. Children sat on a board placed across the arms of the chair to boost them high enough. By the 1980s, unisex salons and franchise chains began replacing the independent barber, and the spinning pole grew rarer on American streets. The ones that remain now feel like monuments to a slower kind of commerce. Number 50. The radio flyer wagon. It was red, it was steel, and it was the first set of wheels most American children ever owned. Antonio Passin, an Italian immigrant and cabinet maker in Chicago, started building wooden wagons by hand in 1917 and switched to stamped steel in the 1930s. He named the wagon Radio Flyer after two of the era's greatest marvels, the radio and the airplane. By the 1950s, the little red wagon was everywhere. Children used it for hauling rocks, giving rides, pulling the dog, and building makeshift parade floats on the 4th of July. The handle folded flat for storage and made a sharp metallic clang when it dropped. The wheels left black marks on the driveway. Rust appeared within a year if you left it out in the rain, and most families did. It was not a toy in the usual sense. It was a tool that belonged to childhood, and every kid in the neighborhood knew the sound of those wheels on concrete. Number 49. Duck and cover drills at school. In classrooms across America during the 1950s and 1960s, a film reel taught children that if a nuclear bomb fell, the proper response was to drop under your desk, tuck your head between your knees, and cover the back of your neck with your hands. The star of the film was a cartoon turtle named Bert, and his advice was simple: duck and cover. Schools practiced the drill regularly, the same way they practiced fire drills. The alarm sounded, and 30 children dove under their wooden desks in unison. No one questioned whether a school desk could actually protect a child from an atomic blast. The drill was part of the Federal Civil Defense Administration's broader campaign to prepare civilians for nuclear war, and it reflected an era when the threat of Soviet attack was treated as both imminent and survivable. The drills faded after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 as the public grew more skeptical about civilian preparedness, but children who went through them never forgot the feeling of crouching under a desk and waiting for an all-clear that always came. Number 48. The television that needed to warm up. Turning on a TV set in the 1950s and 1960s did not produce an instant picture. You pressed the power knob, heard a faint hum, and then waited. The screen stayed dark for 15 or 20 seconds while the vacuum tubes inside heated up. Slowly, a small bright dot appeared in the center of the screen and expanded outward until the full picture filled the glass. If you changed the channel, the image sometimes rolled or flickered until the set adjusted. The warm-up period was a function of the tube technology inside the cabinet, dozens of glass vacuum tubes that needed to reach operating temperature before they could process a signal. Solid-state transistors began replacing tubes in the late 1960s, and by the mid-1970s, most new television sets turned on instantly. But the memory of sitting in front of a blank screen, waiting for the glow to spread, belongs to an era when patience was built into every appliance in the house. Number 47. The Home Permanent Wave Kit. The Tony Home Permanent hit the market in 1944, and within a few years, women across America were curling their own hair in the kitchen. The kit came in a small box with a bottle of waving lotion, a neutralizer, curling rods, and end papers. The smell was unmistakable, a sharp chemical odor somewhere between ammonia and rotten eggs that filled the house and clung to the curtains for days. The process involved winding wet hair around small plastic rods, applying the waving lotion section by section, waiting the prescribed time, and then neutralizing. If you left the solution on too long, the curls came out tight and frizzy. If you did not leave it on long enough, the wave dropped out by Tuesday. Mothers did it for daughters. Sisters did it for each other. The advertisements promised salon results at a fraction of the price, and for millions of women who could not afford a salon visit, it delivered close enough. Number 46. Typewriter Correction Fluid. Before the delete key existed, every typing mistake was permanent unless you had a small bottle of white liquid and a tiny brush. Liquid paper, first mixed up in the early 1950s by a secretary named Bet Nesmith Graham in her kitchen in Dallas, Texas, was the original brand. You painted a thin coat of white fluid over the error, waited for it to dry, and typed the correct letter on top. The smell was sharp and chemical, and the corrected spot was always slightly raised and slightly off-white against the rest of the page. White Out, made by the Bic Corporation, became the main competitor. Offices and classrooms burned through bottles of the stuff. In schools, half the students used it to fix typos, and the other half used it to write on their notebooks and book covers. Word processors and personal computers rendered correction fluid nearly obsolete by the 1990s, though bottles still sit in office supply aisles for anyone who keeps a typewriter around. Number 45. The double feature at the Saturday matinee. For a quarter or 50 cents, depending on the decade, a child could walk into the local movie theater on Saturday afternoon and not come out until the sun was going down. The deal was 2 full-length films, a cartoon, a newsreel, and sometimes a serial. Those cliffhanger adventures that ended with the hero dangling from a cliff or tied to a set of railroad tracks. You would have to come back next Saturday to see what happened. The theater itself was a destination. The floors were sticky with spilled soda, the seats folded up with a thump. The candy counter sold milk duds, jujubes, good and plenty, and boxes of popcorn with real butter that soaked through the bottom. The whole crowd was children, dozens of them, and the noise level before the lights went down was somewhere between a school cafeteria and a riot. Ushers with flashlights walked the aisles and pulled out anyone who threw popcorn, which meant someone got pulled out every week. The double feature was not just entertainment, it was supervised childcare at a price every family could afford. Parents dropped their kids off at noon and picked them up at 4, and nobody worried about what happened in between because the answer was always the same. They sat in the dark and watched movies. By the 1970s, rising film rental costs and the arrival of multiplex theaters with staggered showtimes killed the double bill. The last generation of children who experienced it can still remember the moment the house lights came up between films and the entire audience groaned because it meant the first movie was over and the second had not started yet. Number 44. Homemade soapbox derby cars. Long before organized racing leagues made the sport official, kids in neighborhoods across America built their own gravity-powered cars out of whatever they could find. A wooden crate, a set of old wagon wheels, a 2x4 for an axle, and a length of rope for steering. The car had no engine. You pushed it to the top of the steepest hill on the block, climbed in, and let gravity do the rest. Braking was accomplished by dragging your feet on the pavement or, in emergencies, by crashing into something soft. The official All-American Soapbox Derby, held annually in Akron, Ohio, started in 1934 and gave the backyard sport a national stage. But the real racing happened on residential streets after dinner, with no helmets, no guardrails, and no parental oversight beyond someone shouting to watch for cars. The homemade derby faded as liability concerns and organized youth sports took over the after-school hours. Number 43. TV snow and static between channels. Before cable television delivered a clear signal on every channel, the spaces between stations on the dial were filled with visual noise, a hissing, flickering blizzard of black and white dots that people called snow. Turn the channel selector past your last available station, and that is what you got. The noise was actually electromagnetic interference picked up by the antenna, including, as scientists later confirmed, a tiny fraction of residual radiation left over from the Big Bang. Nobody in a living room in 1970 knew they were watching the edge of the universe. They just knew the screen was full of static and there was nothing on. The hiss was constant and hypnotic. Children stared at it. Some families left the TV on static as background noise when every station signed off for the night. Digital television, mandated by federal law in 2009, eliminated analog snow completely. Modern TVs display a blue screen or an error message. The snow is gone. Number 42. Pay toilets. There was a time when using a public restroom required exact change. Pay toilets were installed in bus stations, airports, train terminals, department stores, and highway rest stops across the country. A coin-operated lock on the stall door demanded a dime before it would open. The practice dates back to the early 1900s, but the pay toilet became widespread in mid-century America. Opponents argued that it was discriminatory, pointing out that urinals were free while sit-down stalls were not, which meant women always paid while men had a free option. The Committee to End Pay Toilets in America, formed in 1968 by a college student in Dayton, Ohio, lobbied state legislatures to ban the practice. Several states did exactly that in the 1970s. By the early 1980s, pay toilets had vanished from most public spaces in the United States. The coin-operated stall lock became a relic of a time when even basic needs came with a price tag. Number 41. Burma Shave roadside signs. From 1927 to 1963. A small shaving cream company in Minneapolis turned American highways into a running joke. Burma Shave planted a series of small red signs along rural roads, each one carrying a single line of a rhyming verse. The signs were spaced far enough apart that you read them one at a time as you drove, building to a punchline on the fifth or sixth sign, which was always the brand name. Does your husband misbehave, grunt and grumble, rant and rave? Shoot the brute some Burma Shave. At their peak, the signs lined more than 7,000 stretches of highway across the country. Families read them aloud on road trips. Children in the back seat competed to spot the next one first. The signs were taken down in 1963 after the company was sold to Philip Morris, and the roadside verse disappeared from the American landscape. But anyone who drove a two-lane highway in the 1950s can still recite at least one. Number 40. The gas station attendant who pumped your gas and checked your oil. Pulling into a gas station used to mean pulling up to a pump and waiting while a uniformed attendant walked out to your car. He pumped the gas, cleaned the windshield with a squeegee, checked the oil by pulling the dipstick, and sometimes even checked the tire pressure. All of it was included in the price of a fill-up. Full-service stations were the norm from the 1920s through the 1960s, and the attendant was often a recognizable figure in the neighborhood. Self-service pumps started appearing in the late 1960s and early 1970s, offering a lower price per gallon in exchange for doing the work yourself. 90. The transition happened fast. By the 1980s, full service was a premium option at best and non-existent at worst. New Jersey and Oregon held out longer than any other state, with laws requiring attendant service that lasted decades. Oregon finally allowed some self-service in 2018. New Jersey remains the last state where someone else still pumps your gas by law. Number 39. The Fallout shelter sign. During the height of the Cold War, bright yellow and black signs appeared on the sides of buildings in cities and towns across America. 3 inverted triangles inside a circle with the words Fallout Shelter printed in block letters. The signs marked public buildings that had been designated as emergency shelters in the event of a nuclear attack. Schools, courthouses, church basements, post offices, and large apartment buildings. Inside, crates of survival supplies were stored and sometimes forgotten. Water drums, crackers, medical kits, and sanitation supplies, all stamped with the Civil Defense logo. The shelter program was run by the Department of Defense starting in 1961, and at its peak, more than 100,000 buildings carried the sign. The program was quietly defunded in the 1970s as nuclear strategy shifted away from civil defense, but the signs themselves were never formally removed. Faded and rusting, some still hang on buildings in cities across the country today. Ghosts of an era when ordinary Americans were expected to survive the unthinkable. Number 38. Catching fireflies in a mason jar. On warm summer evenings across the eastern half of the United States, backyards and open fields lit up with tiny flashing lights. Fireflies, also called lightning bugs depending on where you grew up, drifted just above the grass, blinking in slow pulses. Children chased them with bare hands, cupped them gently, and dropped them one by one into a glass mason jar with holes punched in the metal lid. A jar with a dozen fireflies inside glowed like a lantern. Some kids brought them into the bedroom and set the jar on the nightstand. By morning, the glow was gone. The ritual required no equipment, no supervision, and no plan. It started when the sun went down and ended when someone called you inside. Firefly populations have declined in recent decades due to light pollution, pesticides, and habitat loss, and in many places where they once filled the night sky, the flashing has grown noticeably thinner. Number 37. The diaper service truck. Before disposable diapers became affordable and before home washing machines could handle the volume, many families subscribed to a diaper service. A delivery truck arrived once or twice a week, picked up a canvas bag of soiled cloth diapers from the front porch, and left a fresh bag of clean folded ones in its place. The diapers were commercially laundered, sterilized, and returned in neat stacks. In the 1950s and 1960s, diaper services were a thriving industry in cities and suburbs across the country. DD Diaper Service and Stork Diaper Service were among the bigger names. The arrival of Pampers in 1961 and Huggies in 1978 slowly eroded the customer base, and by the 1990s, most diaper services had closed. The truck that used to stop at every third house on the block simply stopped coming. Number 36. No seatbelts in the car. For decades, riding in an automobile meant sitting wherever you wanted with nothing holding you in place. Children stood on the front bench seat between their parents, babies rode in a parent's lap, teenagers sprawled across the back seat or sat on the rear window ledge. Seatbelts existed as early as the 1950s, but they were not standard equipment in most American cars until federal law required them in 1968, and even then, almost nobody used them. Wearing a seatbelt was considered unnecessary, even slightly insulting to the driver's skill. Click it or ticket enforcement campaigns did not begin until the 1980s, and mandatory seatbelt laws took years to pass in many states. New York was the first to require them in 1984. The generation that grew up riding unbelted in the back of a sedan or sprawled across the cargo area of a station wagon simply accepted a level of risk that would be unthinkable in a car today. Number 35. Kick the can after dark. When the streetlights came on, the game did not stop. It moved into the shadows. Kick the Can was played on sidewalks, driveways, and front lawns in neighborhoods across the country, and the best version happened after sundown, when hiding spots multiplied and the kid who was it had to listen as hard as they looked. The rules were simple. An empty tin can sat in the middle of the street, one player guarded it, and everyone else hid. If you could sneak close enough to kick the can before being tagged, the round reset. The game could last an hour or two, and the boundaries were whatever the group agreed on. The Henderson's hedge, the fire hydrant, the alley behind the hardware store. There were no organized leagues and no trophies. It was pure, unstructured after-dinner entertainment. By the time video games and organized evening activities took hold in the 1980s, the sound of a tin can skidding across asphalt after dark had grown quieter in most neighborhoods. Number 34. The ironing board always set up in the kitchen. In many households through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, the ironing board was not something you took out and put away. It stood open in the kitchen or the laundry room at all times, like a piece of furniture. Permanent press fabrics did not exist in any meaningful way until the late 1960s, and even then they were expensive and limited. That meant nearly every piece of clothing, every bedsheet, and every tablecloth in the house needed ironing. A woman could spend hours each week standing at that board, pressing a hot iron across damp cotton while watching a soap opera on the kitchen television. The spray starch can sat on the counter within arm's reach. General Electric and Sunbeam made the most common home irons. By the 1980s, wrinkle-resistant fabrics and the rise of casual dress codes reduced the ironing load dramatically, and the permanent ironing board station disappeared from most American kitchens. Number 33. The knife sharpener who came through the neighborhood. In towns and cities across mid-century America, a man with a grinding wheel mounted on a small truck or pushcart made regular rounds through residential streets. He announced his arrival with a bell, a whistle, or simply by shouting. Housewives brought their kitchen knives, scissors, and sometimes garden shears out to the curb, and the sharpener went to work on a spinning stone wheel, sending a shower of sparks into the air while the children watched. The whole transaction took a few minutes and cost a quarter or 50 cents per blade. The service was part of a larger ecosystem of itinerant tradespeople who came to you instead of the other way around. The milkman, the Fuller brushman, the ice delivery driver. As suburban sprawl made regular routes harder to sustain and cheap imported knives became disposable, the neighborhood sharpener disappeared from most American streets by the 1970s. Number 32. The wall-mounted can opener in the kitchen. It hung on the wall beside stove or near the edge of the counter, usually screwed into the cabinet frame at just the right height. The design was simple: a crank handle, a small cutting wheel, and a magnet that held the lid after it was separated. You clamped the can under the blade, turned the crank in a smooth circle, and the lid came off in one piece. There was no motor, no cord, and no batteries. Every kitchen in America seemed to have one, and the brand most people recognized was Swing Away. The magnet that was supposed to catch the lid worked about half the time. The other half, the lid dropped back into the can, sinking into the liquid inside, and you fished it out with a fork and cut your finger on the edge. Electric can openers replaced most of them by the 1980s, but the wall-mounted model lasted longer than it probably should have, mostly because it never broke. Number 31. The swimming hole. Before public pools were built in every town and backyard pools became affordable, the place where children swam in summer was whatever body of water happened to be nearby. A bend in a creek, a quarry that had filled with rainwater, a pond at the edge of a farmer's field, or a wide spot in a river where the current slowed down. The swimming hole had no lifeguard, no chlorine, no concrete deck, and no posted hours. You showed up, stripped down to whatever you were willing to get wet in, and jumped. A rope swing tied to an overhanging branch was the height of luxury. The bottom was mud, rocks, and whatever else had settled there over the years. The water was cold, brown, and occasionally home to snapping turtles. Nobody worried about water quality tests. The swimming hole was free, open, and unsupervised, and for generations of American children, that was all it needed to be. Number 30. Smoking sections in restaurants. For decades, the first question a hostess asked when you walked into a restaurant was not how many people were in your party. It was smoking or non-smoking. The restaurant was divided into two zones, separated by nothing more than a row of booths or, at best, a half wall. The smoke drifted freely between the sections, making the distinction mostly symbolic. Denny's, Howard Johnson's, Perkins, and nearly every family restaurant chain in the country operated this way through the 1970s and 1980s. Ashtrays sat on every table in the smoking section, and lighting up between courses was routine. California was the first state to ban smoking in all restaurants, passing its law in 1995. Other states followed over the next decade, and by the mid-2000s, the indoor smoking section had been eliminated in most of the country. The idea that a restaurant once asked where you wanted to sit based on whether you planned to light a cigarette now sounds like a relic of an entirely different culture. Number 29. The vacant lot as the neighborhood playground. Every neighborhood had one. A weedy, undeveloped plot between two houses or behind a row of stores where children built their own world. The vacant lot was a baseball diamond, a football field, a fortress, and a racetrack, depending on the day and who showed up. A home plate was a flattened cardboard box. The bases were whatever was available, a rock, a shirt, a hubcap found in the weeds. There were no adults, no schedules, and no equipment beyond what the kids brought or invented. The lot might be full of broken glass and rusted cans, and nobody cared because that was just the terrain. In cities, the vacant lot was sometimes the only open space for blocks. In suburbs, it sat between new construction like a pocket of wilderness. As real estate values rose and every buildable plot was developed, the vacant lots shrank and vanished. Organized sports leagues filled the gap with schedules and uniforms, but they never quite replaced the freedom of an empty field with no rules. Number 28. Lead paint on everything. For most of the 20th century, the paint on the walls of American homes, schools, playgrounds, and cribs contained lead. It made the paint more durable, more vibrant, and more dangerous than anyone publicly acknowledged for decades. Children in older homes chewed on windowsills, peeled flakes off the wall, and inhaled dust from surfaces that had been painted and repainted for years. The health effects of lead exposure, including developmental delays, behavioral problems, and neurological damage, were documented as early as the 1920s, but the paint industry resisted regulation for half a century. The federal government finally banned lead in residential paint in 1978. By then, millions of homes had layer upon layer of lead paint embedded in their walls. Remediation efforts continue today, and lead paint remains one of the most widespread environmental hazards in older American housing stock. Number 27. The drive-in restaurant with car hops. Before the fast food counter became the standard, eating out often meant staying in your car. Drive-in restaurants lined the highways and main streets of American towns from the 1940s through the 1970s. You pulled into a designated spot, and a car hop walked out to take your order, sometimes on roller skates. The food came on a metal tray that hooked onto the edge of your rolled-down window. Burgers, fries, onion rings, and milkshakes served in frosted glass cups. Sonic, A&W, and hundreds of independent drive-ins operated across the country. On Friday and Saturday nights, the parking lot doubled as a social scene. Teenagers cruised in, parked next to their friends, and spent hours ordering Cokes and listening to the radio. The rise of indoor fast food chains in the 1970s and 1980s pushed most drive-ins out of business. A few survive today, but the culture of eating a meal in the front seat of your car while a car hop lost a tray on your window belongs to a different generation. Number 26. The postman who came twice a day. Before the United States Postal Service consolidated residential delivery to once a day, mailmen in most American cities walked the same route twice between morning and evening. The first delivery, around 9 or 10 in the morning, brought the bulk of the day's mail: bills, letters, circulars, and catalogs. The second pass, usually early afternoon, caught whatever had arrived at the post office after the morning sort. In smaller towns, the mailman was as familiar as the grocer. He knew every family on the route by name. He knew who was expecting a check from the government, who was waiting on a letter from a son stationed overseas, and which house had a German shepherd that needed a firm word before he opened the gate. Children waited on the porch steps for birthday cards from grandparents, and the presence of a thick envelope with an unfamiliar return address was enough to make a mother stop what she was doing and open it at the kitchen table. The mailman carried a leather satchel over one shoulder, wore a uniform with a peaked cap, and in many neighborhoods he walked. No truck, no van, just a man on foot covering miles of sidewalk in all weather. In winter, a glass of water or a cup of coffee left on the porch was a common gesture. In summer, some families set out a cold drink. It was a small courtesy, but it reflected the fact that the mailman was not a stranger passing through. He was a regular presence in the rhythm of the day. When the second delivery was eliminated in the early 1950s, the change passed without much protest, but the day lost one of its markers. Mail had been a twice-daily conversation between the household and the outside world, and when it dropped to once, something about the pace of the day shifted and never quite came back. Number 25. Palmer Method Handwriting Drills. The last quarter of this list belongs to the things that shaped a childhood from the inside. The rituals, the objects, the small private experiences that nobody photographed but everybody remembers. Palmer Method penmanship was one of them. In classrooms across the country from the 1920s through the 1970s, children spent entire class periods making rows of identical loops and ovals on lined paper. Myan. The Palmer Method was a system of muscular movement writing, meaning the arm did the work, not the fingers. The teacher walked between desks correcting posture, grip, and slant. The goal was uniform, elegant cursive that looked the same whether you were writing in Oregon or Alabama. By the 1980s, schools began de-emphasizing cursive in favor of print and eventually keyboarding. Today, most states no longer require cursive instruction. An entire system of handwriting that once defined what it meant to be literate in America has been quietly retired. Number 24. Tinker Toys and Lincoln Logs. Two of the most enduring construction toys in American history were built on the simplest possible concepts. Tinker Toys, introduced in 1914, were a set of wooden dowels and round connector discs with holes drilled around the perimeter. Lincoln Logs, created in 1916 by John Lloyd Wright, the son of the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, were miniature notched logs that stacked into cabins, fences, and forts. Neither toy required batteries, instructions, or much explanation. You opened the canister, dumped the pieces on the floor, and started building. The structures were never sturdy. A Tinker Toy windmill collapsed if you looked at it wrong, and a Lincoln log cabin fell apart the moment someone bumped the card table. That fragility was part of the appeal. You built it, it fell, and you built it again. Both toys are still manufactured today, but the cardboard canisters they came in and the rainy afternoons they filled belong to a time when a child's imagination was the only operating system required. Number 23. The Pogo Stick. A metal pole with a spring at the bottom, 2 foot pegs on either side, and a rubber tip that hit the ground with every bounce. The concept was simple. Stand on the pegs, grip the handles, and jump. Staying upright for more than 3 bounces was an achievement in the beginning. Mastering it meant bouncing down the sidewalk without veering into the grass or falling into the hedge. Competitions on the driveway settled who could go the longest without stopping. The springs wore out faster than any parent expected, and the rubber tip ground down to a flat nub on concrete. SBI Enterprises sold millions of them through the 1960s and 1970s, and the Pogo Ball, a later variation, became a brief craze in the 1980s. For a toy with no electronics, no batteries, and no instructions beyond bounce, it held the attention of children for a remarkably long time. The bruises it left on shins were a badge of effort. Number 22. The coin-operated newspaper box. On sidewalks and street corners in every American city and town, a row of metal boxes in primary colors stood side by side, each one belonging to a different newspaper. You dropped your coins into the slot, pulled the front panel down, and took a single copy from the stack inside. The honor system governed the transaction entirely. You could have taken every paper in the box, but almost nobody did. The boxes were a fixture of daily life from the 1950s through the 1990s. The morning ritual for millions of men was a walk to the corner, a quarter in the slot, and a newspaper folded under the arm on the way back. The decline of print journalism emptied the boxes one by one. Some cities pulled them from the sidewalks, others left them standing, rusting and empty, as quiet monuments to a time when the news arrived on paper and cost less than a cup of coffee. Number 21. The ditto machine at school. Before the photocopier reached every classroom, there was the spirit duplicator, and every student in America knew it by its smell. The teacher cranked a handle on the side of the machine, and out came worksheets printed in that unmistakable purple ink. The pages were still slightly damp when they hit your desk, and the first thing every kid did was lift the paper to their nose and breathe in. That sweet chemical smell was the unofficial scent of elementary school in the 1960s and 1970s. The ink transferred from a master sheet coated in a waxy purple dye, and the copies got lighter with each run, so the kids at the end of the line sometimes got sheets they could barely read. Teachers who needed more than 40 copies had to type a second master. The machine itself was messy. Purple stains on fingers, on desks, on shirt cuffs. Schools phased them out through the 1980s as photocopiers became affordable, but that purple smell is one of those things nobody who experienced it has ever forgotten. Number 20. The chrome toaster on the kitchen counter. It was a gleaming two-slot appliance with a Bakelite base and a lever on the side that lowered the bread into the heating element. The exterior was polished chrome that reflected the entire kitchen in a warped funhouse version of itself. Every morning the toaster popped and the whole house smelled like warm bread. The heating coils glowed orange behind thin metal grates, and if a crumb fell to the bottom, a small wisp of smoke rose from the slots. Toast settings were unreliable. One notch too high, and the bread was charcoal. One notch too low, and it was barely warm. Children were warned never to stick a fork inside, a warning that implied someone had already tried it. The Sunbeam Radiant Control Toaster, introduced in 1949, became iconic enough to be displayed in the Museum of Modern Art. Newer plastic toasters eventually replaced the chrome models, but none of them ever looked like they belonged in the kitchen the same way. Number 19. The 5-cent cup of coffee. At the diner counter, at the truck stop, at the lunch counter inside the Woolworths, a cup of coffee cost a nickel, and the refill was free. The waitress poured it from a glass pot that had been sitting on a warmer since 6 in the morning, and it came in a white ceramic mug thick enough to survive a fall. Nobody asked what roast it was. Nobody asked where the beans came from. It was coffee, it was hot, and it cost less than a newspaper. Cream came from a small metal pitcher. Sugar sat in a glass dispenser with a metal pour spout. The 5-cent cup held steady through the 1950s and into the early 1960s before inflation pushed it to a dime, then a quarter, and then beyond recognition. The cup of coffee that cost 5 cents and the conversation that came with it were inseparable. You sat at the counter, you drank your coffee, and you talked to whoever was sitting next to you. That part has not come back either. Number 18. Wearing your Sunday best to go downtown. There was a time when going to the department store, the bank, or the doctor's office required getting dressed. Not dressed in the casual sense, dressed in the sense of polished shoes, pressed slacks, a collared shirt for the men, and a hat, gloves, and a dress for the women. Children wore their church clothes. Going downtown was an event, not an errand. The main street had a dress code that no one posted but everyone followed. A man in a t-shirt would have drawn stares. A woman in blue jeans would have been talked about for a week. The shift started in the 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s as casual wear became acceptable in more and more settings. By the 1980s, you could walk into a bank in shorts and sneakers and nobody batted an eye. But for an entire generation, The phrase "going downtown" meant something closer to going on stage than going shopping. Number 17. The television repairman. When the picture on the TV set started rolling, flickering, or disappearing altogether, the solution was not a trip to the store for a new set. It was a phone call to the TV repairman. He arrived at the house with a toolbox and a tube tester, pulled the back panel off the cabinet, and began checking the vacuum tubes one by one. The faulty tube was identified, removed, and replaced on the spot, and the picture came back to life. In the 1950s and 1960s, TV repair was a booming trade. Technicians operated out of small storefront shops on main streets across the country, and house calls were standard. Hardware stores and drugstores kept tube testing machines in the aisle so customers could bring in a suspect tube and check it themselves. Solid-state circuit boards and transistors replaced vacuum tubes by the 1970s, and the economics of repair shifted. It became cheaper to buy a new set than to fix the old one. The TV repairman, who once kept the most important appliance in the house alive, simply ran out of tubes to replace. Number 16. The family road trip before the interstate. Before the interstate highway system was completed, a family vacation by car meant two-lane roads, hand-folded paper maps, and a pace of travel that modern drivers would barely recognize. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized the construction of over 40,000 miles of interstate highways, but the system was not substantially complete until the late 1970s. Until then, families heading from the Midwest to the coast drove on U.S. routes and state highways that cut straight through every small town along the way. You stopped at every traffic light, passed through every main street, and saw every diner, motel, and gas station between home and the destination. A trip from Ohio to Florida could take 2 full days. The car had no air conditioning in most cases, which meant windows down and the wind roaring through the cabin for hours. Children fought in the back seat with no entertainment beyond the scenery and a coloring book. Roadside attractions competed for attention with hand-painted signs. Alligator farms, caves, mystery houses, and diners shaped like giant coffee pots or teepees. Motels with neon signs and swimming pools appeared every 30 miles. The Holiday Inn chain, founded in 1952, grew specifically to serve these long-haul family travelers with a promise of consistent rooms and clean sheets. Rest stops were patches of gravel beside the road with a picnic table and a trash barrel. The interstate changed all of it. The highways bypassed the small towns. The motels lost their traffic and the roadside attractions withered. The trip got faster, safer, and more efficient. But something was lost in the exchange. The family road trip on a 2-lane highway was slow and uncomfortable, and full of arguments. And for the children who lived through it, every mile of it is still perfectly clear. Number 15. Erector sets. In 1913, a New Haven inventor named A.C. Gilbert watched the steel girders of a power line tower being erected from a train window and had the idea for a children's construction toy made of real metal. The erector set was a kit of perforated steel beams, nuts, bolts, gears, pulleys, wheels, and a small electric motor. With patience and the included instruction booklet, a child could build a working Ferris wheel, a crane, a bridge, or a small vehicle that actually rolled. The pieces were sharp-edged, heavy, and entirely metal, and assembling them required a screwdriver and a wrench. The toy won multiple awards and remained one of the top-selling construction kits in the country for over 50 years. Plastic building sets eventually overtook metal ones in the marketplace, and the original erector set went through several ownership changes before production slowed. The brand still exists, but the original all-metal sets in their signature red boxes are collector's items today. Number 14. The percolator coffee pot. The sound of morning in a mid-century American kitchen was the rhythmic bubbling of a percolator on the stove or the counter. The pot worked by cycling boiling water up through a vertical tube and over a basket of ground coffee, dripping it back down through the grounds and into the pot below. The process repeated continuously, growing stronger with each cycle, and the percussive gurgling sound it made was as much a part of breakfast as the smell of the coffee itself. Corning Ware, Farberware, and General Electric made the most popular electric percolators. The stovetop models were even simpler, just a pot, a tube, and a basket. The coffee they produced was hot, strong, and not particularly nuanced, but nobody was evaluating tasting notes at 6 in the morning. Automatic drip coffee makers, led by the Mr. Coffee machine introduced in 1972, slowly pushed the percolator aside. By the 1980s, the drip machine had taken over most American kitchens. The percolator held on in diners, church basements, and the homes of grandparents who did not see the point of switching. Number 13. Homemade popsicles in ice cube trays. Before boxes of popsicle brand frozen treats lined the grocery freezer, children made their own at home with whatever was available. The method was simple. Pour Kool-Aid, orange, juice, or leftover fruit punch into the compartments of a metal ice cube tray. Cover each one with a small piece of aluminum foil and poke a toothpick or a wooden craft stick through the foil to serve as a handle. Then you waited. The freezer in the 1960s and 1970s was not a precision instrument. It could take hours, and the results were unpredictable. Some popsicles froze perfectly. Others froze around the edges but stayed liquid in the center, collapsing the moment you pulled them free. The toothpick handle was always too short, and the foil top peeled away in sticky strips. But they cost nothing, and the satisfaction of eating something you made yourself from a metal tray in the kitchen was its own reward. Number 12. The rubber ball and a game of jacks on the front step. All you needed was a flat surface, a small red rubber ball, and a set of 10 metal jacks shaped like tiny 6-pointed stars. The game was simple. Toss the ball, pick up one jack before it bounced twice, catch the ball with the same hand, then 2 jacks, then 3, all the way to 10, scooping them up in a single grab without letting any of them scatter off the step. Girls played it on front porches, in schoolyards, and on kitchen floors. Boys played it too, though they were less likely to admit it. The jacks were sharp enough to puncture bare feet, and anyone who left a set on the floor found that out the hard way. The game required no batteries, no board, and no instructions beyond watching someone else play it once. Manufactured sets cost almost nothing at the 5 and dime. The game was ancient, variations of it dating back to Greek and Roman times, but for American children in the 1950s and 1960s, it was as current as anything on the playground. Number 11. The record player in the living room. Before cassette tapes and compact discs, music at home meant a record player. It sat in the living room, sometimes as a standalone turntable on a shelf, sometimes built into a wooden console the size of a dresser with speakers behind a fabric grill. A vinyl record went on the platter. The tone arm swung over, and the needle dropped into the groove with a soft pop and a faint hiss before the music started. Albums spun at 33 1/3 revolutions per minute. Singles spun at 45 and needed a plastic adapter to fit the wide center hole onto the spindle. Children learned early not to touch the grooved surface because fingerprints meant skips. A scratched record repeated the same half-second of sound until someone bumped the needle forward. Columbia, RCA Victor, and Capitol pressed millions of records a year through the 1960s and 1970s. Families built collections that filled shelves and milk crates. The ritual of sliding a record from its sleeve, placing it on the turntable, and lowering the needle was as familiar as turning on a light. Cassettes arrived in the late 1970s, and the compact disc followed in 1983. And within a decade, the turntable had been boxed up and stored in most American homes. Number 10. The Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday night. Every Sunday at 8 o'clock on CBS, a man who could not sing, could not dance, and could not tell a joke introduced a lineup of acts that had nothing in common. A plate spinner followed an opera singer. A ventriloquist followed a rock band. Ed Sullivan understood that a family watching one television together needed something for everyone, and for 23 years he delivered it. On February 9, 1964, An estimated 73 million Americans watched the Beatles perform on his stage. Elvis Presley, the Rolling Stones, the Supremes, and Richard Pryor all appeared there. A Sullivan booking could launch a career overnight. The format seems impossible now. One live show, watched by half the country, featuring a juggler and James Brown on the same bill. When the show was canceled in 1971, Sunday night television lost its anchor, and the idea of an entire nation watching the same thing at the same time started to fade. Number 9. The Ragman with his horse-drawn cart. In older American cities through the 1950s and into the 1960s, a man with a horse and a wooden cart still came through certain neighborhoods, calling out for old clothes, rags, scrap metal, and anything else a household wanted to get rid of. He was the ragman, and his trade was older than the country itself. The call varied by city: rags, old clothes, in some places a bell or a whistle in others. Children ran to the window when they heard it. The ragman collected what was offered, sometimes paying a few coins, sometimes simply hauling it away. The materials were sorted and sold to scrap dealers, paper mills, and textile recyclers. The ragman was part of a circular economy that existed long before the word recycling entered common use. As curbside trash collection became universal and the horse-drawn cart became impractical on paved suburban roads, the ragman disappeared from American streets. In a few older neighborhoods in the Northeast and Midwest, the memory of that call drifting down the alley is still sharp. Number 8. Leaving the front door unlocked all day. In small towns and suburbs across America through the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s, most families did not lock their doors during the day, and many did not lock them at night. The front door was left open with just the screen door latched, and neighbors walked in without knocking. Children wandered between houses freely. The mailman left packages inside the storm door. The idea that someone would enter your home uninvited simply did not register as a realistic concern in most communities. Crime existed, of course, but it was not something that shaped the way ordinary people secured their homes. The shift began in the 1970s and 1980s as news coverage of crime increased. Suburban expansion made neighborhoods less familiar, and home security systems became affordable. Deadbolts, chain locks, and eventually electronic security systems became standard. The era of the unlocked front door ended not because the world became more dangerous overnight, but because the perception of danger finally caught up with the reality that had always been there. Number 7. The flexible flyer sled. On the first real snowfall of winter, the flexible flyer came out of the garage. It was a wooden sled with thin steel runners and a crossbar at the front that you steered by pushing it left or right with your hands while lying flat on your stomach. The company began making them in 1889, and the design barely changed for the next 100 years. The sled was fast, nimble, and completely unforgiving on a steep hill. You pointed it downhill, pushed off, and held on. Stopping meant dragging your boots in the snow or rolling off into a drift. The runners left 2 thin grooves in the snow that other sleds followed for the rest of the afternoon. Cheap plastic sleds and saucers replaced the flexible flyer for most families by the 1990s. They were lighter, cheaper, and did not require a coat of wax to keep the runners from rusting in the basement. But nothing that came after felt quite as serious as strapping yourself onto a wooden sled with steel runners and aiming it straight down the steepest hill in the neighborhood. Number 6. The Sunday Drive. On Sunday afternoons, after church and after dinner, families across America piled into the car and drove, not to a destination, just to drive. The Sunday drive was a ritual with no purpose other than getting out of the house and seeing what there was to see. You drove past farms, through small towns, along rivers, and down roads you had never taken before. The windows were open. The radio played softly. Children pointed at horses and counted water towers. Nobody was in a hurry, and the drive ended whenever the driver decided to turn around. Gas was cheap enough that the cost barely registered. The Sunday drive was a product of an era when the car was still a source of wonder and the American landscape was something people drove through slowly instead of past at 70 miles an hour. By the 1980s, weekend schedules filled up with organized activities, gas prices climbed, and the aimless drive lost its place in the family routine. Number 5. Getting a dime from the tooth fairy. Losing a tooth was a small event with a reliable reward. You put the tooth under your pillow before bed, and in the morning you found a coin in its place. In the 1950s and 1960s, that coin was almost always a dime. By the 1970s, it had grown to a quarter, and inflation pushed it to $1 by the 1980s. The ritual was universal. Every child believed in it, at least for a while, and every parent had a story about nearly forgetting and scrambling for change in the dark at midnight. The tooth fairy existed in that short, fragile window of childhood where magic and money overlapped, and the going rate for a molar said something about the economy of the household. The tradition continues today, though the average payout has climbed well past $5 in many families. But the original exchange rate, a small tooth traded for a thin silver dime under a pillow on a school night, belongs to a simpler kind of childhood. Number 4. The screen door slamming shut in summer. There is no sound more specific to a mid-century American childhood than the wooden frame of a screen door hitting its jamb. The bang echoed through every house that kept its front or back door open in the warm months. The screen door was the barrier between indoors and outdoors, and children passed through it dozens of times a day, always letting it slam behind them. Mothers shouted, "Don't slam the screen door!" and children slammed it anyway, every single time. The springs that held the door closed stretched over the years and lost their tension, and the latch never quite caught, so the door bounced open and closed 2 or 3 times before settling. The mesh screen kept the bugs out and let the breeze through, and the sound of its slamming was the background percussion of every summer afternoon. Down the times, central air conditioning sealed the houses shut. Solid-core storm doors replaced the wooden frames. The sound faded from American neighborhoods so gradually that most people did not notice it was gone until they heard it again somewhere old. Down the times, it was gone until they heard it again somewhere old. Down the times, the neighborhood block party. Once or twice a summer, someone on the block organized a party that shut down the entire street. Sawhorses went up at both ends, and for one afternoon or evening, the road belonged to the neighbors. Folding tables appeared on the pavement, covered in potluck dishes, casseroles, potato salad, baked beans, deviled eggs, and more desserts than anyone could eat. Someone set up a grill. Someone else dragged out a cooler full of soda and beer. Children ran in packs through the street, riding bikes, throwing water balloons, and staying out later than usual because the rules were suspended. Adults stood in clusters with paper plates and talked to people they waved at all year but never actually spoke to. The block party was democratic in a way that few other events could be. Everyone on the street was invited, and most of them came. The tradition has not entirely disappeared, but the frequency has dropped sharply since the 1970s, replaced by fenced backyards, busy weekend schedules, and neighborhoods where people know their neighbors less well than they once did. Number 2, the sound of your mother calling you home for dinner. There were no cell phones, no text messages, and no way to reach a child who had been gone since morning. When it was time to come home, your mother stepped onto the front porch or the back stoop and called your name. Her voice carried down the block, across the vacant lot, and into the creek bed where you were turning over rocks. Every kid in the neighborhood knew the sound of their own mother's voice, and they could tell by the tone whether dinner was almost ready or whether they were already in trouble. Some mothers used a specific whistle, others rang a bell. A few just screamed. The system worked because the neighborhood was small enough and quiet enough for a human voice to travel. Nobody questioned it. When you heard your name, you went home. That sound, a parent's voice cutting through the noise of a summer evening, is one of the most universal memories of an American childhood, and there is no technology that will ever replace it. Number 1. The long summer day that never seemed to end. This is the one that ties all the rest together. Not a product, not a brand, not a thing you could buy or point to on a shelf. Just a feeling. The morning started with the screen door slamming and did not end until the sky turned orange and your mother's voice carried down the block. In between, there was nothing scheduled. No camp, no practice, no plan. You made it up as you went. A bicycle, a stick, a creek, a friend, a dog. Lunch was whatever you found in the kitchen, and you ate it standing up. The afternoon stretched out so far ahead of you that boredom was not a complaint but a luxury, the kind of empty space where imagination fills in every gap. You came home with dirty knees, a sunburn, and no memory of how you spent the last 6 hours, only that you were not ready for it to end. Those days do not exist in the same way anymore. Schedules have filled the space. Screens have replaced the boredom. But anyone who lived through one of those summers remembers the weight of a day that felt like it would never run out of hours, and the slow shock of discovering, years later, that it had. That is 100 things you might be old enough to remember. Some of them are gone because the world moved on. Some of them are gone because we let them go without realizing what we were losing. If even a handful of these brought back a memory you had not thought about in years, drop it in the comments. Which one hit the hardest? Which one did you live every single day? If this felt like home, hit subscribe. There is plenty more where this came from. Until next time, take care.